My literary hero, the Anglo-Irish author and playwright Oscar Wilde, known for being a paragon of both wit and wisdom, was once famously quoted as saying, "Nowadays, people know the price of everything and the value of nothing." I can think of no better way of using words to perfectly sum up the nature of our current times. I am not sure at exactly what point it happened, but somewhere along the line, we became completely and wholly obsessed with the concepts of money and price. While I resignedly understand how this has come about in the world of business, what I do not understand is how and why this concept of putting a price on just about everything has reared its ugly head in every other avenue of endeavor. How often have we found ourselves saying in casual conversation phrases like, "getting the most value for my money," or "it is worth every penny," as if we were somehow justified in assessing value and what things had it or did not. Our own principles even felt it necessary to list as one of its very opening statements that we respect the inherent worth and dignity of every person, as a response to the fact that we live in a culture that has spent much of its time telling us precisely who and what it thinks has value, and to try to move beyond it as a faith. What is even more insidious is the fact that by putting so much emphasis on what has value, we also communicate by our own inaction the things that do not have value to us. And the reality is that, as much as we may hate to admit it, the environment and the natural world around us often occupies the top of that list. As much as we may appreciate the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part for its beauty, it is often the first thing that is sacrificed or neglected in our quest for money and profit. Sure, money might make the world go round, but what is left if there is no world to make go round at the end of all?
Amen.
It is at this point that I have the pleasure of stepping back and allowing a friend of this church, who has done a lot of thinking about this and how do we fix it, to offer their reflections and hopes for the future. Please welcome back to our pulpit, Director for Northern California of California Interfaith Power of Light, and a fellow UU ministerial colleague, the Reverend Greg Stevens.
Morning. I only have so much time, so I'm going to go right into it. Ours is a rich tradition, the Unitarian tradition, of radical thought and radical praxis. But both Unitarianism and Universalism were liberal Christian traditions at once, and they understood the Unitarians for Jesus to be a prophet, a human being, but a really good one, right? And the Universalists thought that God's love was overwhelming, that even Satan could be redeemed, is what Origen said. The collected stories that make up the Bible are very much a part of our UU history. So we should take the Bible seriously, especially the calls for social justice. There are over 2,000 Bible verses that address poverty, most of them focusing on those made poor by a society that fails to provide to all our needs. From the Hebrew scriptures to the Jesus story and the early church movement, we see a radical call to care for the poor and the oppressed through a transformation of society that more vividly reflects the queerdom of heaven. One of my favorite stories in the Bible comes from Luke in the book of Acts. It's the story of Pentecost, which is when the Holy Spirit is said to have enlivened the early church. The Spirit falls, the room shakes, and everyone starts speaking each other's languages, foreign language, but able to communicate with each other. And then this is recorded in Acts 2 and Acts 4. I put them together. All who believed were together, and they had everything in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all, as anyone had need. Now, the whole group of those who believed were one of heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as owned lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what they sold. They laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each other as they had need. As the early church movement began to grow in the first and second centuries, communities started to develop theologies around who Jesus was and who God was in relationship to the Jesus movement. It's important to remember that religion in this time was also deeply connected to everyday parts of life. There wasn't really a distinction between religion and politics. So if you did theology, in many ways you were making political statements. So both Unitarianism and Universalist theologies emerge out of North Africa, which is a fun thing to remember with a denomination with a kind of a white problem. The oldest roots of our tradition actually come out of North Africa. And so it was Arius of modern day Libya who pushed for an understanding of Jesus as an incredibly important figure, but not God. And it was Origen of modern day Egypt who brought universalism to the forefront, saying that even Satan, as I said earlier, could be saved, and then he was burned at the stake. Speeding up through history to the 19th century, the Unitarian and Universalist movements also stood on the margins of Christian thought by elaborating these same ideas with more clarity. Jesus was a prophet and brought good news to the oppressed, and God's love is absolutely for all, no questions asked. These apparently radical ideas often got us UU ministers kicked out, left to the side. My office is shared with the Unitarian Universalist Church in Oakland, and on all the rooms, they had these little plaques of UU history, but the one on their sanctuary is most interesting. The first pastor there, it was a Presbyterian church. Their name was Laurentine Hamilton, and he was kicked out, defrocked, and his ordination was taken away from him because he refused to say that there was a hell that people were going to go to and that God's love wouldn't embrace them. So he said, well, to heck with it, let's get rid of that, and then they switched the church to a Unitarian church. And so the story of UU Oakland is literally a minister getting kicked out because he didn't believe in hell. Both Unitarians and Universalists, before and after our merger in the 60s, have been deeply engaged in the abolition of slavery. Starr King, who's buried in front of the San Francisco church that I go to, was one of the key leaders in leading abolition work. We've also been part of the BIPOC liberation movements, the women's suffrage movement, worker struggles and the labor struggles, queer social change, anti-war activism, on-campus student movements, and of course, the environmental movement. For many years, our movements have been speaking out for siloed, marginalized people groups, people of color, gay people, the environment, these siloed individual pieces. But what we're learning with the climate crisis is that the climate affects every one of those individual identity groups. And so now it's one way of tying all of our struggles together and still saying, let's fight for queer liberation because it means environmental justice. Let's fight for Black liberation because it actually is environmentally just. These sorts of ideas are also poetically expressed. I'm not sure if you're following, but it's about to be our General Assembly, and we're revising, which it's in our bylaws that we revise our values every 15 years, and we bypass that, we missed that. But this year we're really doing it. So we're looking at the 7 principles, 8 principles, and we're revising them. And so there's this thing called the Article 2 Study Commission, and they've done a lot of great work on this. And so one of the themes is interdependence, which you might remember as the 7th value or principle, which is interconnected web of existence. So let me read what it says in better language than I have. We honor the interdependent web of all existence. With reverence for the great web of life and with humility, we acknowledge our place in it. We covenant to protect Earth and all beings from exploitation. We will create and nurture sustainable relationships of care, respect, mutuality, and justice. We will work to repair harm and damaged relationships. But how do we make this a reality when the sea levels are rising? The planet's temperature has not been this hot for hundreds of thousands of years. When I was in Sacramento this past week and it was 104 degrees, made for good lobbying though, because you were like, look, it really is that hot. Plastics are in our bodies, little microplastics. They're also filling up the oceans to where there's little islands that you could probably go hang out on that are just full of plastic. How do we get from the fossil fuel-driven world that we live in to a sustainable society and a livable planet? Well, the first step, I think, is that we got to get to the root of the problem. This is what makes these ideas radical, is that they're going to the root of the issue. So many environmentalists will wrongly assume that carbon pollution is our biggest issue. But when we look deeper, it's actually the mode of production, the way we produce and create our society, that is based on endless growth and endless profits that produce the carbon problem. Climate change is therefore a great free market success. To solve the problem then is not simply to get rid of carbon or sequester it. Everyone's trying to create new technologies to sequester carbon. Trees do that. That's what trees are. It's to transform the mode of production that sees the world as a resource to one that sees the world as a relative. Our current capitalist mode of production is based on greed, not on human or planetary need. Otherwise, we'd all have healthcare, housing, education, transportation, and food, because those things are human rights. Instead, they're commodified and sold. There is no solution to this crisis, this climate crisis, under this greed-driven capitalist production, as the planet will never take precedence to profit, to the bottom line. So the problem is carbon, but not in the bigger picture. The problem is the economy and how it's structured. And remember, econ means home, and it's about home management. And so economy isn't just about money that those people do. It's about how do we structure our society? How do we manage our human relationships with one another? And the way in which it's currently done is through exploitation and the endless plunder of resources, not relatives, right? So endless growth, the centralization of the world's profit, all produced by actual working people, not those in charge, into the hands of a very small group of people. You remember the Occupy movement? We are the 99%. It's actually the 99.99%, and the 0.01% is the one with all the goodies. We know, though, that those with all the power are those with all the money. Often this is hidden, though, under the guise that our political system is run by representatives of the people. But we know our politicians do not represent us as much as they represent the dominant financial donors in the system, the capitalist system. Under capitalist modes of production, human needs are not centered, rather greed is, profit is centered. In stark contrast, our Unitarian Universe values call us to value human needs over human greed. Thus, it's a simple and logical conclusion that we must build a society based on planetary needs and not profit. With climate change running amok, it's also not simply a moral question, but a question of our actual survival, a question of necessity. This is why we're forming the Unitarian Universalist Eco-Socialist Network, because climate change isn't a game. The world is on fire. This is a very real and very scary reality. So our response should be the same. We have to stop talking and we have to get organized. We have to get serious. Our enemies, the capitalists, are very serious and they're winning. We cannot expect to change the world simply by voting for nicer capitalists or protesting out front of their offices. Our working class socialist traditions have a strategy and they have a vision, and they've been at this work for a very long time. It's time we join them and we join the movement to fight like hell for this planet. So join me in coffee hour after this to learn more about what I mean by eco-socialism. Doesn't really go well in a sermon necessarily, it's not as poetic, but we can get more into what that means and what it means to develop a network that's going to take seriously that we're up against climate change. And the only way we can get there is if we come together and strive for a world, build a world, and build a movement that creates a world that embodies the queerdom of heaven that I spoke to earlier. Thank you, and blessed be.